Well, hopefully you can see. I think the presentation will be, I think it's been recorded, so hopefully you'll be able to catch up again. There's quite a bit of information today, but please ask questions afterwards or during, and I'll try and explain everything. What I'm talking about today is going to be intercropping. There's lots of things we do on the farm, but intercropping is what I'm concentrating on today. And I'm giving it as a farmer's view, experiences we've had over the last 8 years, and trials that we've done on farm, and hopefully that'll be immediately transferable to you guys in Sweden. So where am I? In the southeast of England, so we're quite a bit further south than you, but we're there, so we're closer to France than we are to most of England, if you want to have an idea of whereabouts we are.
Okay, let's see. The sound lost. We lost you on sound. Hello? Okay, so we don't hear you, Andy.
Turned itself off.
No, now we can hear you.
For some reason, it turned itself off.
Okay. Good.
Okay. Can we see that?
Okay.
Okay. Can we see my screen?
We are getting yes from the chat function.
Okay, good. Okay, so in terms of cropping, we're very varied. Our main crop would be winter wheat, but we try and grow a wide variety of crops, and that's part of the whole system, is having diversity. And the cropping for 2021 is fairly similar. It changes depending on the year and depending on the fields and the weeds, etc. We like to be flexible. In terms of my journey, I returned to the farm in 2003, about then, and that's when I started on this soil health journey, and it's been nearly 20 years now. But it's been a slow transition from strip till, no-till, to adding cover crops, adding sheep, companion cropping, and intercropping to where we are today. It certainly hasn't been a magic fix in 1 or 2 years. It's been a long journey with a lot of mistakes and a lot of learning too. I was fortunate enough 5 years ago to be given a Nuffield scholarship, which allowed me to travel around the world, and I visited Sweden too, to visit farmers who are practicing intercropping, and that has given me a whole world view of what can be possible, and I have brought those ideas back to the farm too, and I had to write a report which is can be found on the Nuffield International website if you want to search that to see my findings from my report. In terms of the farm, my long-term goal is to design a farm system, and system is the key word there. That means I can grow crops with the minimal input as possible. And for me, again, the key to that is diversity, and that's where one of the things where the intercropping comes in. This is just to quickly, for me, there's lots of things, as I said, there's lots of things we do on the farm, but not one of these things is the key. They all work together. So the companion cropping, intercropping is part of this system, and all of these things improve as soil health improves. And as the more you do of them, the more the soil health improves. 5 years ago, I decided, as we're a conventional farmer here, we're not organic, I decided to have a plan of reducing our inputs by 50%. We have managed that. But again, I'd say the main reason I've managed it is because we're farming as a system. There's not one thing I've done which has managed us to do that. There's many different things, and intercropping is part of that. And people ask me, well, why did you want to do that? Obviously financial reasons, but I think these two graphs here show a perfect reason why I'm doing it. The first one on the left is from Canada, and the blue line is the total income from farming. So that is the amount of money generated in agriculture, and the green line at the bottom is the amount of money that the farmer takes home in their pocket. As you can see, most of the money in agriculture does not end up with the farmer. So when I showed this to our local levy board, I asked them to do the same for the UK. And so the graph on the right shows the total income from farming since the 1970s in the UK. And the line at the bottom shows how much goes home in the farmer's pocket at the end of the day. So there's a massive disparity between how much money is in agriculture and how much money can be made. So my plan, my goal is to grab some of that money back to the farm and stop giving it away to other parts of the industry. So now I'll quickly introduce what I mean by intercropping. Simply for me, it is the growing of 2 or more crops in the field at the same time. And they can be harvested at the same time, they can be harvested at different times, and it can be livestock forage, doesn't necessarily have to be with a combine harvester for arable, but it's just having at least 2 species of the field in the field at the same time, and it covers a wide range of crops and options, and I'll try and cover some today. But as with most things in agriculture, intercropping is not new. The first known intercrop was 5,000 years ago, and this was the Native Americans used to grow what's called the 3 sisters, which is maize, pole beans, and squash. And the idea was that the maize would grow tall, the beans would grow up the maize and use them as a trellis, and the squash would be in the bottom as a weed mulch. So they, 5,000 years ago, were getting 3 crops off the same bit of land. So I asked the question, why 5,000 years later is the most common sight on farms around the world a monocrop of varieties, crop species that are exactly uniform genetically. They're prone to the same pests, same diseases, same weeds. You'd think in 5,000 years we'd have learned something, but for me, we have gone backwards. Monocultures is something that we need to get away from. Easier said than done, I would admit. So to look at what Mother Nature does, this is what I quite often do on the farm. I look around the bits that aren't farmed on our farm and see what is happening. This is what my farm would look like if I wasn't there, or if no humans were there. It would be temperate woodland. As you can see, there's different plant species. There's trees that are growing high up into the sky. There's shrubs, which is the understory layer. There's annuals, there's biennials, perennials, and they're not only filling all the space above and below ground, they're also filling the space in time over the year. So within that system, something will be coming to harvest, coming to flower, for 9 months of the year. The problem we do in farming is we only harvest once a year, and quite often for us, when the sun is shining the most, which is sort of July, August, September, there is not even a crop in the ground. That is where we have become very inefficient in our capture of sunlight, because that is what as farmers we are doing, we are capturing sunlight. So for me, intercropping, we know with cover crops that they're fantastic for capturing sunlight, they're fantastic for capturing nutrients, for what we're trying, and that's all been proven. So what we're trying to do in intercropping is transfer that benefit of cover crops into your cash crops. So this is a picture of a cover crop on my farm from this week. And as you can see, none of those plants look like they are deficient of any nutrients. The oats in there don't look like they need any more nitrogen. I haven't applied any. There's no disease in there. Pest damage is minimal. So what that is showing me that when you mix plants, you do not get the problems of monocultures. If I was growing those sunflowers by themselves, I would need additional nitrogen. I'd probably have to be applying fungicides because they'd be getting disease. When you mix together, you don't get these problems. The trick is trying to do it practically in modern farming, and it isn't as easy. It sounds easy, but it isn't as easy as as it sounds. So temporary intercropping, I think Philip mentioned this in his presentation. This is the first one we did in 2012, and that is a companion crop of vetch and buckwheat with my winter oilseed rape. It worked very well. We did a small strip, and the following 2 or 3 years we grew all our oilseed rape like this. Unfortunately, due to other reasons, we no longer grow oilseed rape. But this is probably one of the most common companion crops, intercrops that you'll see around the countryside now, is with oilseed rape. It's been shown, there's been lots of studies in France and the UK, and it's been shown to be very beneficial. One of the main pests over here, since we've lost neonics seed dressings, is cabbage stem flea beetle, and companion cropping has been shown to help with that. And this is data from Jake Freestone, who's a farmer in England, and what he is showing, a net benefit of companion cropping oilseed rape of £35 a hectare, because he's using less herbicide, using less fertilizer, and yet less insecticides, and this net benefit is before the increase in yield. So that's some figures that a farmer's actually put on this technique. This is from France, and I apologize for the quality of the picture, but what it is showing is traces, drawings of the roots of oilseed rape at the top and faba beans at the bottom, and it is showing when they are grown together that the faba beans change their rooting habits, and also does the oilseed rape. In France, faba beans are one of the most favoured companion crops to have with oilseed rape, and what they've found is that once you put it oilseed rape next to a bean, the rape roots deeper into the soil profile, and the faba bean changes its rooting habits and roots shallower in the soil profile. And this is something that this year, and I'll talk about it a bit later, we have noticed in the intercropping that it really does affect the way roots behave. And we've got to remember that things going on underground are just as important as things are going on above ground. But that was just an interesting thing that they found 5 years ago, that faba beans made the rooting of oilseed rape improve. And that's one of the downsides of oilseed rapes, is it likes to root shallow. So why do we do this? Improve rooting, as I just talked about. They've shown improved germination with companion cropping with oilseed rape. Lower nitrogen need over the year, fewer pest problems. I always put fewer, not none, because nothing is a magic bullet. Fewer weeds, low input costs, and higher yield. On average in France, they show about a 0.3 ton per hectare yield benefit from companion cropping oilseed rape. And the reason it's called temporary intercropping is because the companions either get killed by the winter or by a herbicide, so they're not there until harvest. The farmer will only be taking the oilseed rape to harvest, so it's not there for the whole growing cycle. So winter wheat is our main crop, and if I want to diversify my system, I need to make sure that there's diversity within our winter wheat crop. So this time last year, I started doing trials with companion cropping with winter wheat. These are the species that I tried. This was a trial. There's some good work from France and other parts of America to show that there is benefits of companion cropping wheat in terms of nutrient capture, pest damage, etc. So I wanted to try it, but I wanted to see what would work in our system, in our climate. So out of that, eventually the only ones that actually survived the winter and survived our herbicide regime was the vetch and the beans. Everything else never really came to very much. This is autumn 2019. So I only have results for the vetch and for the beans. And this is the reason I'm doing it, or that's why I was trying it, to see if I could copy the results that have been found other places around the world. But I will show you what we did find last year in this trial. The first thing we tried was to see whether the companion cropping with the beans and the vetch, which again, like the oilseed rape, was killed out in the spring, so it was only the wheat going to harvest, was whether they would affect the grain nutrition. This is one thing that people are getting quite keen on over here, is testing the grain to see how well you've done with your nutrition applications throughout the year. Unfortunately, we found no significant difference. They look different on there, but they're not really significantly different. I was hoping to see improvements in nitrogen with the companion, but I didn't. And I was also hoping to see improvements in the protein of our grain. We grow milling wheat, and protein is one key thing for quality. And if we miss that, it is just feed wheat, which for us is not a good thing. And in a low input system that we're doing, lowering nitrogen application rates, my biggest worry is lower protein. I was hoping that the companion cropping would improve our protein results, but last year, harvest 2020, we didn't see any, but it was probably the worst harvest or worst yearly conditions we've had for a long time. So how much you take from one year, it's difficult to say. But we didn't see any benefit in nutrition or protein. We did see a very slight benefit in yield. It's not a benefit that is amazing and made us lots of money, but there is definitely something there to go forward. So for that reason, I decided to try it again this year on a field. And this is what it looks like at the moment. On the left, you have the beans, and on the right, you have no beans with the wheat. This field is a very wet, very heavy clay field. And my feeling is that this technique with the beans is going to work a lot better on marginal ground with water issues, clays, waterlogging, because I believe the beans will help drainage throughout the profile and help the wheat get through the winter, improve the rooting of the wheat. And this is what the rooting does look like at the moment. We've had a lot of rain in the last 5 weeks, a quarter of the year's rainfall in the last 5 weeks, so it is wet. But you can just about see on the left that the bean roots, even though they're not too big, are going down deep, and hopefully the wheat roots will follow them down. But we will see. We will see how well the results from this harvest. It's a ongoing work with this one. This is probably one of my biggest successes. We grow spring linseed, and one of the main issues of growing spring linseed is a pest called flax flea beetle. And what this flea beetle does is, just as the linseed is poking through the ground, it starts to eat it. And 3 years ago, I think it is, I suppose 3 years ago, we had terrible issues with flax flea beetle. I sprayed the field 3 times with insecticide, and it made absolutely no difference. But while I was walking across the field, I noticed in the linseed there was a patch of wild oats, so a weed. And I noticed in that patch of wild oats, as you can see in that picture, that the linseed was growing fine. The pest damage was a lot lower, and it wasn't thin. So that got me thinking, well, if wild oats seems to help linseed grow, then why can't tame oats? And why shouldn't I be why don't I add oats into my whole acreage of spring linseed as a companion? So last year, harvest 2019, we did a trial to see. So we had different plots. We're basically trying linseed without oats, linseed with 70 plants per square metre of oats, and linseed with 140 plants per square metre of oats. This trial had 2 scientists working on it as well, so the data you're seeing isn't mine, it's done by them. And what we found, this is pest damage. So you can see on that graph where there's 0 along the bottom, 0 oats, the pest damage was a lot higher, and where there's 140 plants per square metre and 70, the pest damage was a lot lower. Next graph, this is the growth stage of the oats, or the height of the linseed, and we were finding that the linseed was taller and growing faster the more oats that we had in the field. We think that is probably due to competition, but it's obviously an advantage if you're trying to get your crop away from a pest, is to have it grow faster. So that was a positive result. And this is the plant count. We found that we had better establishment where there was oats, and that could be seen from the field when standing there from the combine. Even once we'd killed the oats out, because the oats are only there for 6 to 8 weeks, you could still see where we'd had linseed without the oats because it was a lot thinner. And the most important bit is the yield. We found having a companion of oats with our linseed for the first 6 to 8 weeks of growing the crop, we got nearly a 20% yield bump increase. We're not quite sure what the oats are doing, whether it's just deterrent or just confusion, or just actually competing with the linseed to get it grow faster. But it's been a very good result. And last year we did all our acreage of linseed with oats, and that is what it looked like with the oats, and that's what the fields look like at flowering. Linseed for us was one of our best crops this year. It's not too difficult this year, but it was one of our best crops, and it's turned linseed into a risky crop, to one that I feel that we can grow economically and with more consistency, because certainly the insecticides do nothing anymore on flax flea beetles. So using companion cropping has been a big success for our linseed. So Piola, this is another example. This is the first intercrop I grew and took to harvest together. This idea is from Canada, is growing peas and oilseed rape together. So spring peas and spring oilseed rape. And the idea being that the oilseed rape will hold the peas up off the ground. Anyone who's ever grown peas will know in a wet harvest, you're scraping the combine across the top of the field to try and lift them up, and you probably get just as much soil as you do peas into the combine. So the idea of this is the oilseed rape is there to hold the peas up, and you get an extra crop. So for the first 2 or 3 years of doing this, it worked fantastically well. And then we started to get issues with the spring oilseed rape not establishing very well, and even once it got established, it wouldn't grow very well. So last harvest 2019, we did another trial with innovative farmers to try and see if we could improve the spring oilseed rape establishment with the peas. The answer was no. We can no longer grow spring oilseed rape reliably with our peas. These graphs are irrelevant really, because the trial was a failure. The peas were good, but the spring oilseed rape was not. So this time last year, I had these questions. We know our peas are high value. We know in a wet year they will be on the floor, difficult to combine. So how do we go forward? And some of the ideas I have are oats with the peas, barley with the peas, mustard with the peas, maybe rye. All have their issues, but we went for oats, mainly oats because they are a break in terms of between our wheat crops, and we can easily take oats out of wheat, but we can't take barley out of wheat. So this year just gone, we tried peas and oats together, a trial with Diversify, which is a European project, and looking at the seed rate of oats. For me, our peas are high value, so I don't want a yield loss of peas. At the same time, you've got to have enough oats there to hold the peas up. So what we were trying to find was how fewer peas, oats we can plant to still hold up the peas, because oats can be very competitive. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to process the results yet for this, but this shows a picture of the peas and the oats together of one of the plots. One issue we did find this year, it's been a very extreme year, is the oats were still very green when we came to harvest the peas. The peas are early to harvest, same time as winter wheat, and the oats are only half mature, which didn't matter in the end, but it's something that we need to look at. But you can see there the peas were standing well, and there's the peas by themselves in the strip. They were leaning. Luckily it was a fairly dry harvest, so it's still relatively easy to combine the peas. But in a wet year, that would have been a difficult harvest. So you can see some differences, but we still haven't got the results, unfortunately, yet to know what ratio worked the best in terms of yield. One of the things for me with a changing climate, we've had 2 very extreme years here in terms of climate, actually 3, this is 3 years ago, is that intercropping allows us to reduce our risk. The field in this picture is a field of spring beans with spring oilseed rape, and this is on marginal ground, and if we hadn't grown spring beans with the spring oilseed rape, you can see the top half of that field would have been bare. So this is one of the key things to take home from intercropping, is it's a risk management tool. Sometimes you may not get much of a financial reward, but you'll even up your yield across your field. Our fields are very variable in terms of soil type, and very small in some places as well. And this again was shown last harvest, 2019. This is beans and oats, and this is a wet headland outside of a field. It always lies wet, and as you can see on the outside where it lies wet, the oats did not do very well and the beans dominated. And as you get away from this wet headland, you get more oats growing. So again, if I planted that field with just oats, I would have had thin places on the headlands. So it's trying to even out your crops, especially in this very extreme weather conditions we're having nowadays. And that's just showing the top bean was bean that was intercropped, and the bottom one is a bean that was not intercropped, and it is showing that we got more pods and more flower where it was intercropped. Unfortunately that year it was so hot that a lot of the flowers aborted and we didn't get a difference in yield, but it did show potential that we can get better podding and flowering from intercropping. Plant disease, we're trying to reduce our fungicide and we've reduced it by over 50%. In beans, faba beans, which is one of our main break crops, disease is probably our biggest risk, our biggest issue. And work was done in the 1990s in the UK to show that mixing beans with oats or wheat reduced your incidence of disease by 50%, and that was in organics. And chocolate spot is probably one of the biggest issues in disease. and I presume chocolate spot is probably an issue in Sweden too. It's a wet weather disease. It's botrytis, and can completely decimate your crops, especially in this country. I see a lot of organic farmers trying to grow beans, and they normally die a month before conventional crops because they've been ravaged by either rust in the dry year or chocolate spot in a wet year. But growing them with a cereal really does help reduce that risk of disease. So this is why we tried 3 years ago, or one of the reasons we tried faba beans with oats. I tried it in just a strip in one field. I tried it for a few reasons: for the disease, which I've talked about, also weed control. We are getting less and less weed control in our beans, so having the oats with the beans, they will help compete weeds. And the other one is improving the yield. So this is a yield map from the field, and we did a strip through the middle of mixed cropping, and the rest of it was just beans. And as you can see, the darker blue in the middle there, where that strip was, is a higher yield, and it gave us a 15% higher yield in that trial. So we thought we would try that on a bigger scale and try that on a more complicated trial. So with PGRO, who are basically our legume levy board in the UK, I'm now working with them to try and tease out the intricacies of intercropping. In 2019, we did this trial, basically having beans by themselves, oats by themselves, and then different ratios of beans and oats to try and see how they react together, and for disease and yield and economics. So they're sown quite late because it was a difficult year. Establishment was reasonable, not fantastic, but reasonable. Yields, as you can see there, yields, you can see from that data that oats are very competitive. Even at low rates, oats are still very competitive. So we did lose bean yield compared to the bean monoculture, but overall, there was a definite yield increase with the mixing of the two. And the oats by themselves had normal nitrogen applications to it as well, whereas everything else had no additional nitrogen. LER is land equivalent ratio. Basically what it is saying is if it's above 1 in a mixed crop, you're getting more from that field than you would from the monocultures by themselves. You see beans and oats are sat at 1. So at number 2, it's about 1.3, so that's basically 30% more output from the same area of land. And as we are getting more population and more and land, more pressure on land, getting more from that land is what we should be trying to be doing. And again, intercropping is one tool that can help us do that. And this was shown on our fields last year. And the most important thing in the end, we all have to make a living, is gross output minus variable costs. As you see, the variable costs are fairly low, and we found 250 to 300 pound a hectare better income from where we were mixing beans and oats compared to where we had oats and beans by themselves, which is a significant result. It makes that break crop viable. We've found that our winter wheat pays the money, and the break crops are just there to be between our wheat, and our farm margin is lower because of the break crops. What I'm trying to do with intercropping is increase that farm margin by improving the outcomes or outputs from the break crops, which are our weak points in the farm system economically. So again, we did the same trial this year with PGRO, and unfortunately I haven't got the results yet. They haven't processed them. This year was difficult. The yields weren't as high, but it was definitely a yield increase from having the two together. But whether we're going to get the same kind of economic benefit, I am not sure. So I'll have to wait and see on that yet. But the rest of that, around that trial, the rest of that block of land was destined for spring oats, and I decided to put a few beans in with my spring oats. So it was spring oats with beans rather than beans with a few oats. And that is what it looked like at grain fill, and that has had absolutely no additional nitrogen. The reason I added the beans in there with the oats was to help the health of the oats and to reduce the inputs, and it seemed to work very well. The majority that we combined was oats, but we did get a few beans as well, and we didn't have the costs of nitrogen on those crops. Normally a spring oat crop in this country would get between 110 and 130 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. That had nothing. So again, reducing the reliance on inputs and hopefully improving the environment at the same time. One thing that PGRO were keen to look at was the disease aspects. I talked about chocolate spot 5 minutes ago. So they decided they wanted to do to see what difference it made by putting beans and oats in strips, different widths of strips, and alternating rows as well, and to see whether having them in strips, having distance between the plants, would help disease, especially things like chocolate spot. So we had a funny looking field, and the neighbours probably thought it looked very strange. So that's just an example of 3 meters of beans and 3 meters of oats. They did find significantly less disease where the crops were mixed, but again, I haven't had the results, unfortunately, to see how much lower, but it was a significant amount of less disease in the mixtures. Personally, I don't think having them in strips is necessarily practical, or not very necessary, but for this trial they were trying to push the limits to see the difference, and hopefully hopefully we'll get those results soon. Strip intercropping, having them in strips, is something that has been done around the world and can work for certain things, but I'm not sure it's necessary for this mixture. I think you get the benefits when they're just mixed together. Rooting differences I talked about with the oilseed rape, and this is something that we noticed this year massively in our oats and barley, that when you mix spring cereals with a legume, especially beans, the rooting improves on the cereal. So we were going across the trials trying to pull out the cereal plant just by hand, and it was noticeable that you could easily pull out the plant where it was by itself, but as soon as you mixed the plant with a bean or a pea or a lentil, you couldn't pull it out. And so I passed this observation on to the scientists at PGRO, and they went in their trials and tried the same thing, and they took these pictures. The 2 on the left are from monocultures, and the 2 on the right are from intercropping of beans and oats. You can see the beans maybe have less rooting, but the oats, the rooting was improved. This hasn't been quantified scientifically, it was just observations from both of us, but this is what PGRO sent to me from their observations, that the oats seem to have more horizontal roots closer to the surface, more root bulk, and seem to be intertwined with the beans when you mix them together, and very difficult to pull out, which obviously gives a resilience. If it's better rooted better, better resilience against climate differences. Living mulches is something we've been trying for a few years, and becoming more popular, but it's probably more difficult to do. Basically, the idea of a living mulch is to have an understory of a low growing legume like clover or lucerne growing in your cash crops for 3 or 4 or 5 years constantly. This picture here is clover in the bottom of oats, and this is how we first tried it. In France, they grow lucerne with their oilseed rape and leave the lucerne there for 4 or 5 years. We don't have oilseed rape. So 4 years ago, sorry, we tried it, in oats, and you couldn't really see much difference in the oats. But when we came to combining, what we found is that having the living mulch, the clover in the bottom, made the oats much more even, and we got a 15% yield increase in the oats. And some of that, we're not quite sure why that happened, but one of the interesting things is that we couldn't put a herbicide on the oats, and I do think that herbicides can give you, in certain situations, can give you a yield decrease. So maybe some of that yield benefit was not just the clover, it was the lack of not using the herbicide. But the following year we tried the same thing, and we have struggled to get the establishment correct of the clover. The problem with oats, the oats grow so quickly, they can out-compete the clover. I think residual herbicides from the previous wheat crop can affect the clover establishment, slugs, pests, and this has meant that getting a reliable establishment of clover has been difficult for us in our system. So my new idea, which I started last year, is to put the clover into our herbage seed, our ryegrass seed, and also after ryegrass. And this is what I've done this last year. And for an example of the effects you can have with a living mulch, this is from France. On the left had a living mulch in the previous crop, and on the right didn't. So when we think about things like living mulches and intercrops, it's not just the effect in the year you're having the crop, there's benefits going on in years afterwards. And this obviously had improved the soil on the left and gave better establishment of the wheat in the following crop. So PGRO, again, we're interested in this. So we tried, we had a trial this year under our spring beans, which was after grass. And what I'd noticed in previous years, the recommended rate of clover, this is micro clover, which is a small growing, small white clover, was that 2 kilograms I didn't think was enough. So we tried doubling the seed rate, and I think that had definite benefit in our situation. If I was to do it again, I would, which I probably will this year, I would definitely have the higher rate. It doubles the cost, but you get definite benefit. So you can see, can just about see that that's beans no-till direct into ryegrass aftermath, and then the clover in the front just poking up. And what we don't want is the clover to get too strong. You almost, with these living mulches, have to treat the clover badly. Once clover is established, you can almost do what you like to it, and it'll come back. What you don't want you doing, especially in your cereal crops, you don't want it competing and reducing your yield. And this is what it looks like in the winter wheat that was sown a month ago. It's there, it's been sprayed, it's not happy, but we will see in the next year what happens to it, and we'll also see if it has an effect on the wheat yield. This technique is one technique that I really want to get to work, but in terms of management, it's the most difficult. Balancing the growth of the clover and the growth of the catch crop is difficult, but the amount of improvement it brings to your soil infiltration, biology, is huge. So that's one thing I'm going to keep trying, but we definitely haven't cracked it yet. So intercropping has led me to start to grow niche alternative crops. Quite often, niche crops are niche for a reason, mainly because they're difficult to grow. And one thing we've noticed with intercropping is that we can grow these niche crops more safely with a companion. So this is actually an idea I got from Sweden. I know this is linseed, flax, and lentils. Lentils is the niche crop that we've got a very good market for. This last year I did it with oats. This is the lentils with oats, And the major problem with lentils is they're flat to the ground when you come to harvest them, really flat to the ground, worse than peas. So again, the idea of the oats is to keep the lentils off the ground at harvest. But again, it's a high value crop, and I can't have the oats out competing the lentils and reducing yield by very much, because that will hit me financially. So this year we tried to find again what the right rate of oats is for our lentils.
Andrew, I'm going in here and saying that it's time to start summing up.
Yeah, okay, I'm nearly there. That's fine. I'll finish after this one. That's fine. So this is what we did with the lentils. Different rates from 30 to 50 to 70 of oats. In Sweden, they were putting 70. I felt 70 was too competitive. I just wanted to see how the oats worked. This is a picture of lentils by themselves on the left and lentils and oats on the right. Again, we haven't had the results back yet, but it just shows you can just about see the lentils climbing up the oats in this picture. This was at harvest, and that is the lentils at harvest. As you can see, we had a lot more lentils dropped on the ground, and in a wet year those lentils would be fallen on the ground and we would lose them. So there's a balance between competitiveness of the oats and the risk of losing the lentils. But once we get the results back, I will know the right rate for next year. I've covered most of it anyway, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We are going a really interesting presentation, and we're going to